I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. Canada has now counted more than 15,000 dead from COVID-19. Health officials made the grim announcement yesterday. The milestone comes as cases of a new, more contagious variant of the virus that causes COVID-19 has been confirmed in the Toronto area, Ottawa, and on Vancouver Island in BC. The Public Health Agency of Canada said while early data suggests the new variant may be more transmissible, there is no evidence that the variant causes more severe symptoms or impacts vaccine effectiveness. Meanwhile, health officials in Quebec announced 37 deaths related to COVID-19 on Monday, a tally that has helped push the national fatality total past the 15,000 mark. Shortly after that, officials in Alberta added to the total, announcing that 112 people in the province had died over the course of the holidays between December 23rd and the 27th. Dr. Gerald Evans of Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, says reaching the grim milestone in the 9 months since the pandemic began highlights just how serious COVID-19 is. Ontario vaccination clinics for COVID-19 are expected to be back in action today after a pause for the holidays. Critics have taken issue with the decision to take a break, saying that the province can't afford to delay immunizations. On Sunday, the province recorded 2,005 new infections and 18 new deaths related to the novel coronavirus. Officials did not release a daily tally of new COVID-19 cases and deaths yesterday, meaning today's numbers will also cover 2 days. Atlantic Canada is still seeing a small but stubborn jump in COVID-19 infections. Health officials in Nova Scotia say 13 new cases have been identified in the province since Christmas Eve. They say all 13 are related to travel or previously identified cases. New Brunswick is reporting 1 new case, while Newfoundland and Labrador say they have added 2. The first batch of Moderna's COVID-19 vaccine has arrived in the Northwest Territories. The Public Health Agency of Canada says the much-anticipated shipment arrived earlier on Monday, and doses are now set for distribution to remote and Indigenous communities across the region. Photos accompany the tweet and show boxes being unloaded from the FedEx turboprop on a snow-covered airport ramp. Health Canada authorized the use of the vaccine on December 23rd, and the company is expected to deliver 68,000 doses by the end of this week. Canada's premiers and their handling of the COVID-19 pandemic is the subject of the latest poll by Leger and the Association for Canadian Studies. 3 premiers, all from the prairies, scored below 50% satisfaction. Just over half of respondents from Ontario approved of the job that Premier Doug Ford was doing, while neighboring Quebec felt the same about François Legault. Premiers in the Atlantic provinces, which have seen relatively few COVID-19 cases since March, fared the best. A pair of weekend church gatherings in a rural community near Chatham, Ontario, have earned 2 men charges under the province's Reopening Ontario Act. The act limits religious gatherings to just 10 people indoors or outdoors during the province's current lockdown. Local police say they have found more than 100 people inside the Old Colony Mennonite Church without masks at separate services on Saturday and Sunday. The province-wide lockdown took effect on Saturday and will remain in place for 28 days in southern Ontario. Police in Quebec City say they have handed out 41 fines last week for violations of COVID-19 rules limiting social gatherings. Police say they broke up gatherings in private homes, restaurants, and a house of worship. Quebec has restricted indoor and outdoor private gatherings and shuttered businesses deemed non-essential over the holiday period in an effort to stem rising infections and hospitalizations. Montreal police are expected to release information on Tuesday about their interventions linked to the COVID-19 restrictions. Manitoba's premier says it's not easy to tell people that they must close their businesses and put people out of work. Brian Pallister made the admission during a year-end interview with the Canadian press, referencing his upcoming decision on whether or not to extend COVID-19 health restrictions in the province. Mr. Pallister says there will be an ongoing attempt to control outbreaks, but a decision on just how tight public health orders will be in the new year won't be made until the current set of measures expires on January 8th. Search efforts have resumed off the coast of Nova Scotia as the RCMP look to recover the bodies of 5 fishermen whose scallop boat sank nearly 2 weeks ago. Mountie spokesman Sergeant Andrew Joyce says currents in the Bay of Fundy are notoriously ferocious, and Monday's search was being conducted by air. He noted that the RCMP is working on a partnership with the Canadian Coast Guard to secure better sonar capabilities to search for the sunken ship. The body of one crew member was recovered in the hours after the vessel went down early on December 15th. Stay with us. A recent report by the Macdonald-Laurier Institute found that net household savings were more than 10 times higher than that of small businesses during 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic has left no one untouched. But when it comes to the financial blow of lockdowns, it seems that businesses are bearing the brunt rather than households, according to the Macdonald-Laurier Institute's third quarter report. The report highlights the shortfalls of the government's CERB program as helping Canadian homes increase their savings, even with declining earned incomes, while larger sectors of the economy continue to struggle amid lockdown restrictions. Though unemployment rose in 2020, the report finds that net savings for households increased by $686.4 billion, compared to just $14.1 billion in net savings for corporations. As Canada continues to battle the second wave of the pandemic, with Ontario officially in a province-wide lockdown as of Boxing Day, Canadian businesses continue to struggle to survive this historic blow to our economy. Well, joining me now is Philip Cross, MLI Monk Senior Fellow. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thanks for having me back. My pleasure.
So let's start by highlighting the key findings in MLI's recent report.
Well, the major finding is that we continue to find that the government support during the pandemic was much easier and much more aimed at households than it was the business sector. And that's reflected in the savings data you noted earlier. Households were able to sock away well over $600 billion in the first 3 quarters of the year. Firms barely broke even.
And now the financial disparity between net household incomes and savings for corporations was huge, $686.4 billion versus just $14.1 billion. Why such a big difference?
Well, savings reflects both income and spending. And we saw for households, household income in Canada rose more than any other major nation. Government just pushed money out the door into households. At the same time, households didn't spend a lot of that money. So the savings rate jumped to an historic high of 30%, remained very high. And that reflects that a lot of this money went to people who really didn't need it. I mean, obviously, if all the money was going to low-income people who lost their jobs, they would have spent most of it. But a lot of this money ended up going to better off people, and they didn't need the money. And ultimately, this money ended up working its way into the housing and stock market. Meanwhile, corporations, they were seeing a frightful decline in their business. A lot of them had to shutter altogether, and their spending didn't fall as much, so they weren't able to save money. So that's why we saw this sharp discrepancy between the two sectors.
And how does federal aid for businesses compare to that being provided to Canadian individuals?
Well, we've seen quite a stark difference all along. In particular, we saw with households, it was basically no questions asked. You know, just come up and we'll give you $2,000 a month. And as a result, you know, the government ended up writing much larger checks for CERB than they expected. Meanwhile, the wage subsidy program, especially that was aimed towards business, initially that was only going to pay 10% in the first month. And so a lot of businesses didn't have any interest. A lot of the other government programs for business, such as rent aid, were complete flops. So we saw a huge demand, household demand, a much greater response than expected, and a much lower response from business. So clearly that tells you how these programs were designed.
Now, we know the pandemic has left no business untouched, but what businesses were hit the hardest during this pandemic, sir?
Well, the usual suspects were, of course, transportation, particularly air travel, accommodation and food, personal services. But often overlooked is how hard business services were hit. We have all these, office towers sitting in downtowns across the nation that are empty. So we don't need security guards. We don't need caterers. We don't need cleaning staff. So business services that take care of these buildings have been really hard hit as well.
Now, I know that the CERB was meant to help Canadians get through the pandemic financially and help curb people who were laid off. But what effects has this program had on unemployment in general in Canada?
Well, it's capped the way that my former colleagues at StatCan measure unemployment. because a lot of people, because they weren't under any stress, they didn't feel the need to do anything but sit at home and collect CERB checks. They just dropped out of the labor force. And when you're not looking for a job, when you're just sitting at home and dropped out of the labor force, Statistics Canada says, well, you're not unemployed because you're not looking for a job. You may have lost your job, but you're not unemployed. So we saw a much smaller increase in unemployment than we would have expected given the very sharp drop in jobs. So there's a lot of people out there who just weren't looking, and as a result, that's why we're in this curious situation where a lot of people have lost their jobs, and yet a lot of businesses say they can't find workers.
All right, Mr. Cross, we are out of time for this segment, but thank you again for your time today, sir.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Stay with us. More news coming up, starting with some New Year's resolutions for the government from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. As Canadians head towards the highly anticipated new year, there's a growing sense of hope that the troubles of 2020 will fade in the rear view, even though the fight against COVID-19 continues. However, there are steps that can be taken to help Canadians recover and grow following the economic devastation of the pandemic, according to the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. But the ball, as always, is in the federal government's court. And considering that the 2020 year saw Justin Trudeau land on the naughty list, the CTF's annual list of political leaders who failed to support Canadian taxpayers, he has a long way to go to ensure Canadians are not bombarded with new taxes come the new year. Well, to talk more on some taxpayer-friendly New Year resolutions for the Trudeau government, we are joined by Aaron Woodrick, Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Welcome back to the show, sir.
Thanks for having me.
So it looks like Mr. Trudeau ended up on the naughty list this year. Can you tell us a little bit more about this annual list?
Yeah, this is something we do every year just to highlight, which politicians and governments across Canada have been doing good things from a taxpayer standpoint. There's all kinds of reasons for people to like or dislike governments, but we like to focus on the dollars and cents and whether people are sort of respecting what taxpayers are paying and whether they're getting good value for money for the taxes.
And who else is on the naughty list this year, sir?
Yeah, we put a number of groups, the United Conservative Party in Alberta for taking a wage subsidy. We thought that was inappropriate. Ontario Premier Doug Ford made the naughty list because he continued to give out what we call corporate welfare money to business after promising not to. There's a mayor in Quebec who took a 33% pay raise, which we thought was a very bad look this year, so he made the naughty list. And finally, City Hall in Montreal and Vancouver, spending money on things like expensive furniture and art in a pandemic year. Again, just not a very good look.
And we know there's some leaders on the nice list. Would you be able to highlight some of these names?
Sure. I mean, first of all, we've got BC Premier John Horgan. He decided to freeze the carbon tax, so he made life, prevented it from getting more expensive. In British Columbia, there's some city halls across the country, places like Halifax, Lethbridge, Alberta, where they took pay cuts. And the Department of Finance, we actually put them on the nice list because they decided to take tariffs off personal protective equipment, making it easier to get that stuff into the country.
All right, now the CTF has developed some straightforward resolutions for the federal government for the new year, starting with federal aid programs. So what would be the CTF's advice in terms of organizing and spending on such programs?
Yeah, first and foremost, just to get better at who they're delivering it to. We've already heard stories of people abuse these programs, whether it's individuals or businesses. And we understand some of this money had to be spent. But as we go through this pandemic, it's important that the government finds ways to minimize abuse and make sure the money really gets to the people that need it the most.
And this year, the federal government introduced multiple new taxes during a recession, no doubt. So how can it make life more affordable for Canadians in the new year?
Yeah, first and foremost, stop raising taxes. I mean, the Prime Minister said it himself this summer that the last thing Canadians need is higher costs, and yet his government is raising the carbon tax. They're bringing in a second carbon tax called the Clean Fuel Standard. Netflix taxes, payroll taxes, you name it, they're going up next year. So it's just, he needs to be consistent, and he's right when he says Canadians do not need higher costs, and so he needs to stop raising taxes first and foremost.
And in terms of federal spending on non-pandemic related initiatives, how can the government maximize their funds without dipping more into debt?
Yeah, they should look to the private sector there. I mean, most people in the private sector have had to take pay cuts. Some have lost their jobs. Many businesses have gone bankrupt. The government needs to find a way to get by with less. And that has to start with salaries in government. Most people can't understand why, if you work in government, you haven't lost a dime in pay, whereas everybody else who pays the taxes to pay for government employees, they are taking big pay cuts. So I think government's going to have to find a way to save money there.
And I know transparency from our leaders is something really important at this time. So what steps can the federal government take to be more transparent with Canadians and garner more trust in 2021, sir? We've got about a minute left.
Yeah, I would say that the government needs to just keep its own promise. Justin Trudeau was actually elected in 2015 on an excellent set of promises to be more open, more transparent, proactively. Unfortunately, they've broken a lot of those promises, and by some measures, they've actually made things worse than before they came to office. So stop hiding information, be upfront with journalists, be upfront with information requests, and proactively publish information. Don't wait for citizens or advocacy groups or journalists to ask for it. Just put it out there, let people be informed, and they can hold governments to account.
All right, Mr. Aaron Woodrick from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, thank you again for your time today, and Happy New Year, sir.
Same to you.
Don't go away. A look around the world from this past week is up next, starting in the U.S., where President Donald Trump's push for boosting relief funding was shut down. The state of Alabama emerged as an alarming COVID-19 hotspot, and the Brexit trade deal was formally signed just before the end of the year deadline. These stories and more international news coming up on the Forum Daily Week in Review. Stay with us. We'll be right back. U.S. President Donald Trump's push for $2,000 COVID-19 relief checks stalled out. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell blocked a swift vote proposed by Democrats. Republican senators are deeply split over new spending. Mr. McConnell signaled an alternative approach, linking Mr. Trump's demand for aid with restrictions that the president wants on tech companies. One of the most impoverished states in America has emerged as one of the country's most alarming COVID-19 hotspots. Alabama's hospitals are in crisis as the virus rages out of control in a region with high rates of conditions that can make COVID-19 even more dangerous. There is also limited access to health care and resistance to wearing masks. Johns Hopkins University says the percentage of tests coming back positive for the virus is almost 40% in Alabama. New details in the Nashville bombing cases are coming to light. According to documents obtained by the Associated Press, investigators visited the home of suspect Anthony Warner back in 2019 after his girlfriend told them that he was building bombs in an RV trailer at his house. Mr. Warner did not answer the door when officers went to his home, although his RV was spotted in the backyard fenced off. Officers reported being unable to see inside the vehicle. The case was then handed off to the FBI. New York City is closing the books on its bloodiest year after a long time of being known as the safest big city in America. The city recorded 447 killings in 2020 as of Tuesday. That's an increase of over 40% from last year and the largest number since 2011. The number of people shot has also more than doubled last year's total. Police blame challenges posed by the coronavirus pandemic and bail reforms that put criminals back on the streets. But the city's crime spike parallels an uptick across the U.S., and leaders note other large cities had greater rates of killing this year. The European Union's top officials have formally signed the post-Brexit trade deal with the United Kingdom. The documents will now be flown across the Channel to London in an RAF plane for British Prime Minister Boris Johnson to sign them. The UK Parliament will later start debating the agreement, setting up new trade rules between the 27-nation bloc and former member Britain. The agreement needs approval from Britain's Parliament and from the EU's legislature, which is not expected to take up the deal for weeks. Emergency officials in Norway say 9 people were injured and several homes flattened after a landslide smashed into a residential area near the capital city of Oslo. Photos taken in the area showed at least 8 homes had been destroyed. Some 40 ambulances were sent to the scene. An evacuation affecting some 200 people is continuing as officials say there is a risk of further landslides. Well, it isn't a direct travel ban, but China is taking the extraordinary step of urging tens of millions of migrant workers not to travel home during February's Lunar New Year holiday to prevent further spread of COVID-19. The Lunar New Year is China's most important traditional holiday and the only time of year when many workers have the chance to travel home to see their families. Britain has authorized the use of a second COVID-19 vaccine, this one developed by Oxford University and UK-based drug maker AstraZeneca. The move positions the country as the first to greenlight the easy-to-handle shot, which developers hope will become the vaccine for the world. AstraZeneca's chief executive proclaimed that the shot had been shown to be effective, well tolerated, simple to administer, and supplied at no profit. A series of tremors have jolted central Croatia after a 6.3 magnitude earthquake killed at least 7 people, injured dozens, and left several towns and villages in ruins. The strongest 4.7 magnitude aftershock was recorded early today, 40 kilometers southeast of the Croatian capital of Zagreb, where many people spent the night in tents, their cars, or military barracks. In the hard-hit village of Majeski Poljan, where 5 people died in the earthquake, a little boy could be seen sleeping inside a van, wearing a hat on a chilly December morning. A Chinese court has sentenced 10 activists and protesters to between 7 months and 3 years in jail after the group sought to flee Hong Kong by speedboat earlier this year. The harshest sentence was reserved for one of the 2 accused organizers of the ill-fated attempt to reach Taiwan. The court says it won't press charges against the 2 minors. The sentences appear to be a warning to opposition activists who are trying to evade provisions of a national security law aimed at Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex have dropped their first podcast. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle and guests from Elton John and their son Archie appear on the royal couple's first audio release for Spotify. The couple, who stepped down from their royal duties in spring, invited friends and people they admire to record audio diaries that were excerpted for the show. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news from this past week. Remember, for news on demand, you could always check out our website, thenewsforum.ca, and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for updates. All right, thanks for joining us, and we will see you again next time.